Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
We're very pleased today to start a two-part series with some colleagues of mine from North Idaho College, faculty members who this summer went to Greece. One of our favorite topics on this program is questioning people who have traveled around the world so that you, our viewers, can know about those countries and their cultural backgrounds, and very importantly, in case you have plans to go there in the future, you will know more about it, and maybe we can give you some suggestions of what to do while you're there and what to look for and how to learn and appreciate those different cultures. On part one of our two-part series, I'm so happy to welcome my colleague, Jim McLeod. We came to North Idaho College at the same time. It's hard to believe it was 20 years ago, and he will discuss on this program how this trip came about to Greece. But before we do that, I want to take this opportunity and privilege to say something about my colleague on public television. Years ago, when we started this program, Mr. McLeod, on his own time, wrote a grant in which we were able to get funds through the humanities so that we could take this program throughout the state of Idaho, and from that we have flourished to be able to go to other states. And Jim, without your assistance in a time of great need, I don't think that would have happened, and I want to publicly thank you for that. Mr. McLeod also wrote a grant another time, and we got a 12-week series out of that grant, and we studied the real serious problem of alcoholism. So he's been an integral part of this program, and much appreciation from your producer, myself, in what he has done for us. But let's talk about how this came about, Jim, and kind of identify that we do these kind of programs at North Idaho College. And I'm just going to give you the floor to let you introduce us to how the trip came about to Greece.
Well, Tony, that's in my personal case a fairly long story, in that the year before I first met you 20 years ago, I missed my trip to Greece. I had planned to go in 1969, and unfortunately I had a head-on collision in Scotland in a brand new Volkswagen camping bus that precluded the opportunity. So it's been on my mind a long, long time, and it just so happened that I began leading tours to Scotland about 1977, and gave some thought to other places in Europe I'd like to go, and wasn't at that time thinking particularly about leading a tour, but certainly about areas that I wanted to see. So in 1981, my wife, Judith Sildy, and I decided to go to Greece that summer for our first exposure. And as a matter of fact, we were married there, and that may be of interest to some of your listeners. We have our marriage certificate in Greek, and it's an interesting business. We almost missed our wedding there because we had to march around a communist demonstration that they were holding in the streets, and so that was a bit of interesting business too. But we decided that a tour like this, after having visited Greece now many times, we've been there I think 5 or 6 times, would be something that people here on campus would really enjoy. Everyone has always wanted to see the Parthenon. Everyone has always wanted to see some of these ancient sites like Delphi. And my wife and I felt that we could put together a tour along with another colleague of ours, Lloyd Marsh, who is the chair of physical science department here, who had spent a good deal of time on Crete during his, he was working for Northrop at that time, but he had also been in the Navy and had been in the Mediterranean and knew some of the area. So we thought the three of us together made a pretty good team, and we could put something together. And so last year we sat down and did a little brainstorming about this and came up with an itinerary. And we have now, of course, completed that itinerary this past summer, and we feel that it was a very great success, and we enjoyed ourselves immensely. In fact, it was probably one of the most interesting and educational and fun experiences I've ever had as an NIC faculty member with other faculty members on this campus.
Now, how many people went on this trip?
We had 33 of us, and about half that number, roughly, were actually instructors here on campus. The other people were either friends or relatives, and most of them, though, from the local area here. And so it was a fairly large group. We were glad that there were three of us to sort of keep tabs on everybody.
Yes. I know that when we have viewers sitting out there looking at what we're doing as we get into this, there's just a desire to see the map, and you've been very kind to bring a map, and our staff with little notice was able to put this up for us. Could you kind of indicate on the map where you went and kind of the route you took, and then we're going to get into some specifics about Greece and what all you did, and then hopefully we can give some suggestions to our viewers about future trips. But if you would point out on the map some of the routes.
Well, we, of course, didn't fly directly into Greece. Actually, my wife and I went early on to do a little scouting first, but the main party of the group flew into London, and then from London they flew into Athens, which is just here. And then from there they took another flight out here into the Adriatic, and about halfway between Athens here and, believe it or not, Libya, is the island of Crete. Now, the island of Crete, and I don't have a map to show you that, is a fairly large island, and it has a very significant place in European history because, of course, it was an island which actually gave birth to the first really, truly European civilization, the Minoans. Mm-hmm. And the Minoans were wiped out as a civilization around 1400 BC by a volcanic explosion, which in fact destroyed their empire. But as a result of that, a lot of the culture and a lot of the survivors came to mainland Greece and established a new society there, which ultimately grew into what we think of as the classical Greek society of the 4th and 5th century BC. So we wanted to start with Crete because that's, of course, where everything begins in Greek civilization, and we were able to spend a good deal of time visiting a number of sites there, in particular the famous Knossos site. And Hania, which is one of the larger cities on Crete, is where Lloyd Marsh was stationed for a while, and he knows the area very well and the people there very well, and we had a marvelous dinner and so on there. But then we came back to Athens by ferry, took a night ferry back to Athens here, and then took a bus through this area here to Corinth and crossed the canal here that just separates this little isthmus. And then from there we came down through this coast here into the Peloponnese, or what's known as Argos. Argos, of course, is very famous, and if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll see frequent references to Argos. Mm-hmm. And we stopped here at this little, well, it's a very, very picturesque place called Epidavros, or one of the largest, actually the largest stadium, or theater is still in use today. They still have performances there every year. And then came into a little town here called Tolos, which was on the beach, which is a lovely little resort area. And then from this area we spent several days in which we went up to this famous site here, the site of Mycenae, with the famous Lion's Gate, and purportedly the home of Agamemnon, and where one of the greatest treasures that was ever discovered in all of Europe was located at the end of the 19th century by the great archaeologist. Well, I guess he wasn't trained archaeologist, but Schliemann. And then we traveled across the length of the Peloponnese here over to Olympia, and of course you wouldn't want to go to Greece without seeing Olympia. And seeing the site of the famous games and so on, and had a very enjoyable time there. And then went up to this town here called Patras, and across the neck here of this narrow opening out into the Adriatic, and up all along this mountainous route here, clear up to Delphi, which is the famous place of where all Greek religion originated, in the center of the Greek world, not only the Greek world, but much of the ancient world. And many of the buildings and structures there have been, to some degree, have been revitalized, and from that point we swung down through this mountainous region. We visited a monastery in here and then back down into Athens. So you can see it's a fairly good-sized loop that we were
very
working with
extensive
here.
tour,
Yes.
and hit all the very, very important sites historically about the history of Greece. And there's so much history in Greece itself. When you took the trip, I know you had a lot of plans prior to doing that, and could you somewhat take us through the kinds of things that you did while you were there, what you tried to expose as a tour leader, what you tried to expose those people to? A lot of them had never been to Greece before. I assume this is their first trip. Just give us kind of a historical sketch of the trip now. You have done it geographically, but what were some of the events and activities that you tried to expose the group to about the culture?
Well, I'd actually like to start just a little bit before the trip, because we tried to make this, in a true sense, a study tour.
Yes.
A lot of commercial tours you go on, you go to places and you look out the bus window and you see these things, and, well, there's the Eiffel Tower and there's this and there's that. But you don't really have the kind of preparation that you need to fully understand what you are seeing. And so we decided that we wanted to actually have a number of class sessions in which people who were participating in the trip would actually come and take a particular topic or subject and research it and come and speak to us or show us slides about this, so we had some better grasp of Greek culture, and not only Greek culture and history thousands of years ago, but modern Greece as well. And so we spent about 6 weeks going through various topics of this nature in preparation for the trip. So once we were on the trip, then it wasn't necessary for people, when we got to a site, for instance, when we went to Knossos, Lisa Lyons, who teaches art here at NIC, spoke just briefly about some things that people should look for, and then the group was allowed to just go wander about on their own and look at what they were interested in, rather than having them follow a tour guide all around and have lectures at various points. Because the readings and so forth that we had assigned had prepared people to appreciate this and to understand what they were looking at. This, I think, added a great deal to the enjoyment of everybody on the trip. We felt like we were not just there to have fun, although we had many times where we had a marvelous time, but that we were there to learn about this, and it revitalized us all intellectually, and I think that was one of the main reasons that we did it this way. There are many things I could tell you about our focus. Certainly our focus was to try to get as close to the people as possible, and fortunately, since Lloyd Marsh had been in Hania on Crete for a number of years, that he was acquainted with a number of people that we could get to talk with who were local people. And that made us made it a little bit easier for us to have an opportunity to ask questions about the current governmental situation in Greece, or to make inquiries about how people, how the people lived, and what sorts of activities they do, and what are their holidays like, and their religion, and things of this sort that we wouldn't have gotten, I think, if we had been riding around in a bus all the time without having an opportunity to really visit with these people.
One of the criticisms, and it's a mild criticism of tours, is that oftentimes they spend too much time in museums or in cathedrals and at their hotel rather than being with the people. I'm not suggesting that those are not part of the process, but you really took it far beyond that, not only in meeting the people, which is so crucial, but to a lot of sites that normally are not on those tours. What are some of the conclusions, Jim, that others in the tour group and yourself drew about what you learned? I guess I can phrase the question another way. I think of it in the Renaissance approach, that I'm sure you were exposed a lot to the arts and the humanities, but I'm sure to the historical religion and the government and so forth. Just give us your impressions of some of the things that you learned during the trip.
Well, it was a real cross-section of things. Of course, I have never studied Greek architecture before. I've certainly looked at the Parthenon a number of times and marveled at its beauty. But what was interesting for me this time is that we had an opportunity to do some analytical thinking about the way in which it was constructed, and we had a number of people with us who had done some reading on that and who explained some of the means by which these buildings were put together, and why For instance, at the tomb of Atreus at Mycenae, which is a very famous structure. It's a beehive-shaped structure. There's a triangle over the door frame, the entrance into the tomb, and I've looked at it any number of times and thought it was interesting, but I had never understood that it's actually needed there because of the weight and the structure of the building. It's a relieving triangle, and it must be, they needed something like that to invent something like that in order to build that kind of structure. And that's a point that was put forward by Lloyd Marsh and a few other people that had done some reading along those lines that I'd never considered before. So it was a situation where we are even if we had been there previously, we had broadened our understanding of some things that we'd looked at before but really not appreciated that fully. Lisa Lyons, for example, did an extraordinarily nice lecture before we left, and of course when we were in the museums there too, she'd go through and point out a particular vase and point to some of the painting on that vase and explain why they were using a geometric pattern as opposed to another type of pattern, and what was the stage of development of this. These are details that you don't normally get, even in guidebooks, good guidebooks, because you're not being very analytical about your looking. You're just looking. And I think sometimes it's a deeper kind of looking that comes out of something like this, a deeper kind of understanding. Certainly all of us had to work on language on occasion on this trip, and that was certainly an area that we learned a few phrases in Greek that were necessary. And I think that was an enjoyable situation. One of the things for me that I found to be extraordinarily interesting that I hadn't really given much thought to was the primary role that Crete had in World War II. I'd had no real understanding of this, and on one occasion we had gone to a German cemetery in which a large group of Germans had come up to see it, and they had obviously apparently had possibly sons or husbands or something buried there, and some of them were quite moved by this experience of seeing this graveyard, which is actually maintained by the German government, by the way, not the Greek government. But the terrific fight that took place over Crete in World War II, and that the fact that the Germans felt that it was necessary to knock that island out to keep the Allies from holding that and having a base to bomb Italy, and also the one interesting thing for me is how the people on Crete felt about the Germans today. How they, it would seem to, if you'd had, for example, cousins or relatives murdered by the Germans, which happened in many cases, they executed whole villages, men and women in some cases, how they would be able to, because many of their tourists are Germans today, how they'd be able to accept those people still in this time was a very interesting thing for me to do a little study on. I went around and asked a number of Greek people how they felt about this, and they said, well, we remember that. We remember that, but we feel that, that we need to get beyond the past and to try to be as, welcome our European neighbors as much as possible.
And that's amazing because World War II is within contemporary history, and many, many people are alive that experienced that.
That's right, and you'd think it would be difficult for them to forget and forgive that as easily as they have, but the Greek people, that's one thing about their character, I think. They have a tendency to be able to put things behind them like this. They are extremely well known for their hospitality. Of course, this has been part of Greek culture for a long time, and they're very
May I
gracious
interject here and ask you a question about that, because what your group has done, and that'll be commended, is you really got into the depth of the culture rather than, we said, the light touch. And is that because of the fact that they were the center of history and culture at one time? They were the originator of so much. And is that just carried on, even though there are other centers and other places that are surpassed them as far as modern contributions in technology?
Well, I certainly see them as one of the twin pillars of Western civilization, and I think if you don't have at least some understanding of Greek culture and Greek character, and you don't have that background, it is very difficult for you to understand a lot of things that are happening, even in the contemporary scene in the world today. And I felt one of the reasons I wanted to go and have gone so many times is because I feel that many of my students, I try to share some of those things with them because I feel it's so important for them to have that background, to make sense out of this crazy world we live in.
Yes. I just want to pursue that just a little bit further. I saw a video that you people had when you came back. You took a lot of video and then you condensed that and did
about
some
12
editing.
hours, I think.
Yes, right. And I saw the happiness of not only of your group but others that you were meeting in Greece. There is really a very lively atmosphere, isn't there, in Greece? And not the hospitality you talked about, but maybe we can talk a minute about some of the social customs and the foods and so forth. I always on these kind of programs like for our audience to hear about like an evening in a country like Greece, what it's like. Some of the social activities and fun they have and the kind of foods.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind most readily in the evening is that almost every Greek couple, both married and unmarried, will take a stroll around the town in the evening. Usually that takes place 8 or 9 o'clock. Sometimes it's just around the harbor area, but you will see them promenading around this way, and it's a custom they have. And they sometimes the man and the woman won't even be speaking to each other, but they'll just be out walking together, and it's something that they have a strong belief in, that there needs to be a time like that, a quiet time in the day where you are able to be with your spouse, most likely, but it could be some romantic interest there too, I suppose, and just spend some quiet time with them. And I think that's an interesting custom. I sometimes wish we could develop something more like that here, although I'm certain it happens around the resort and so forth in the summer too. But it's something they do on a regular basis. It's every evening. They spend that time together. They have that time for themselves. And it's so hard in our own society today to get that kind of time. They're very gregarious people and very happy people. You'll see them in large groups occasion and celebrating whatever weddings. We happen to be fortunate enough to catch a good part of a wedding while we were there, and you could see from the situation that they were very happy. In fact, one of the things they did, which I thought was absolutely astonishing, is we were standing there like tourists with all of our cameras and all of these sorts of things, and they actually told us to come into the wedding, to come and be part of the wedding. They wanted us to actually be with the people. And I thought that was very interesting. I mean, I would imagine most weddings around here, if you walked in and you were a perfect stranger, they would tell you to go away, but not here. They actually wanted you to join in the joy of it. And they're very. The wedding itself was a very picturesque situation because you have, of course, the Greek Orthodox priest with the high black hat and waving these silver chained vessels full of incense and things like this that were very interesting to watch. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind about that. Other things that I can think of, little small incidents, were where we go into a restaurant or a bar or whatever, and be introduced to the owner, or the owner would come over and introduce himself, and then he would buy everyone a drink immediately, and we tried to pay him. He wouldn't take any pay for it. That's part of their long tradition of hospitality to strangers.
Well, you just learned so much about the people, and there's something else I want to get to before we run out of time. I know something about your background and your work in literature, and you've done some really excellent work too on, like the Soviet Union, where in an oppressed society as it has been in the past, how that affects the world of writing and literature. But you've also gotten very involved and interested in your expertise in relation to Greece. Can you tell us some of the things that you're doing based upon your trips that you've made to Greece? And some of the things that are emerging out in your thinking concerning literature and thought and philosophy?
Well, probably one of the most powerful experiences I've had in Greece was when I spent an evening here. This would have been 2 years ago, not on this particular trip because the theater was not open, but we had a chance to see the play Agamemnon by Aeschylus performed at Epidavros. So here we were seated in this theater, which is 2,500, 3,000 years old, watching a play that was written in the 5th century of Greece, performed, by the way, with, as far as I could tell, with his authentic costumes that they would have worn, including the masks. Very often they wore masks in Greek tragedy. The play was entirely in Greek. And I didn't happen to have an English copy at hand of the text, but it was just an absolutely transcendent experience. And I'd seen a few films done of tragedy before, but nothing like that, nothing in that scope. And it's sort of like looking at a football game on television as opposed to being in the game. And there was a powerful experience in that I won't soon forget. And it really, what it did is it galvanized my interest in Greek tragedy to the point where now I am doing. I've done quite a bit of study on my own. This summer I read 19 Greek tragedies, which is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I like to read the literature of the country I'm in very often, or histories of those countries when I'm traveling like that. And I think it's really changed my concept of what tragedy is, and I think I'm a lot more informed, better informed about that now when I talk about that with my students in one particular class I teach that deals with Greek drama. So that's been one of the outgrowths of this trip that I think has been particularly important to me as an individual. My favorite spot in all of Greece, this is not exactly relevant to what you're talking about, but my favorite spot in all of Greece, of course, is Mycenae, and I've been there now 4 or 5 times. I like to go up and sit on the high walls of Mycenae and think about the Iliad and the Odyssey and Agamemnon, and it's just a powerful kind of thing to realize that, some 3,500 years ago, the ancestors of Agamemnon lived in that place, and that's the place.
It's a special experience.
Yes.
I wish we could continue, but the good news is we can. It'll just be a week. I'm going to have you back with some of your colleagues next week, and we'll do part 2 on your trip to Greece. And I know we've inspired our viewers, and I would just suspect they will be back to hear more of what you have to say and what your other colleagues have to say. Jim, thank you. We appreciate it, and we will see you next week. And I also want to say, while we have time, that we're not too far off. We're headed towards the 900th show on this program, and we're headed, if we keep doing it, to the 1,000th show. We're going to have a special ceremony at that time. We won't invite you now at that because of all you've done for the public forum. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed our program. Please be with us next week at the same time, and we'll do part 2 on Greece. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
We welcome you back to part 2 of our 2-week series on the trip to Greece last summer by some of the people from North Idaho. This was a program that was put together at North Idaho College, and those people who were responsible for putting the program together and are also my colleagues at North Idaho College on the faculty are with us today. We had a great time last week with one member, Jim McLeod, who is in the Department of English at North Idaho College. And Jim, we welcome you back. I certainly enjoyed that program last week. And joining him is Judith Sildy, who is in the Department of History at North Idaho College. And next to her is Lloyd Marsh, who is the chair of the Physical Sciences Department at North Idaho College. We're excited to pick up where we left off last week, and I've heard nothing but good reports from those people who went on the trip with you. And I'm very happy to welcome, as always, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in Idaho, and she shall commence the questioning.
Well, to start our program and to get our viewers in the mood for what is happening here, let's talk a little bit about your study tour philosophy. And let's start with you, Judy, a little bit about what was the philosophy behind your tour?
All right, well, for one thing, we call it a high-adventure, low-budget tour, partially because faculty are notoriously not wealthy, but our real philosophy is to try and travel in the way that the Europeans do, and to try and avoid the very American-style luxury hotels, American restaurants, to try as much as possible to frequent the kind of places that the local people do, and to travel in the way that they do. That would be one. Lloyd, you have?
Well, and then too, I think we offered a unique perspective because we studied before we left. Yeah. We had a long period, 5 weeks as a matter of fact, that we engaged in a class studying Greek culture and Greek history, and we were well prepared for the trip. So it was a little bit unique.
Now, Jim, what kinds of things did you do that got you into the local life?
Well, the restaurants primarily, I think.
It looks like
we, in Hanya, Lloyd actually, I should probably have him speak to this, but he introduced us to a longtime friend there of his while he was living there. And this man who spoke no English but understood English bought us wine, and then I think he bought us several rounds of wine on several different occasions, and he prepared for us a marvelous dinner. I think it's probably one of the best dinners I've ever been to in my entire life, and we have much of that on videotape, as a matter of fact. It's too bad we can't show the audience a few clips out of that, but it was a wonderful, wonderful meal. So that's one way we try to get closer to the local people.
What about another cuisine story? I'm sure you must have lots of cuisine stories. Do you eat on the street as well as in
Yes, as a matter of
restaurants?
fact. Maybe we should just tell you a little bit about the setting where we had this first dinner. It's on a little harbor at Hanya on the island of Crete, and the restaurant is 10 feet from the water. And you have a canopy over the dining area so that you're protected from the rain. As a matter of fact, we had a little shower that night just during dinner, and so the people on the edges had to move in a little bit. But we probably ate our way through Greece. We had unique experiences both in Crete and in the Peloponnese when I think the most memorable place was at Tolo, a place where we stayed for 3 days, and each evening we would have our evening meal together on this beautiful veranda right next to the Mediterranean Sea, and it was just a marvelous experience.
Now, Judy, would you talk a little bit about friendship that you were trying to develop with perhaps some people from Greece?
Well, yeah, we had sort of a head start in that Lloyd had a lot of friends from the years that Lloyd lived on Crete, and it was real enjoyable for the rest of the group members to get acquainted with them, including the restaurateur we were talking about a few minutes ago. But one of the things that was great is that everyone on the tour, I think, made a real effort to be friendly with anybody who they happened to meet, and I think one of the best things that happened is that Dr. Virginia Johnson, the head of the English department, and Len Maddie, who's also in the English department, struck up quite a friendship one day with a lady who ran the hardware store in Nafplion on the mainland of Greece, and became pen pals, actually. And Virginia showed me just a couple days that she had gotten the third letter from this lady. I believe her name is Anastasia. And she was expressing all kinds of sentiments, like, and she kept apologizing for her very poor English, but I feel that civilical people should be friends forever, and I hope we will be friends for life, and I suppose someday I must meet your family, and so on and so forth. That was great. We really enjoyed getting acquainted.
I think that's just a beautiful story about travel, and one of the main things that comes from that's a lifelong benefit. And I do congratulate all of you, and I know that both Judith and Jim have done this many times in Scotland also. And one thing about your trips that are so valuable is that you don't go to a country and stay just at an American hotel and eat there and go to the bar, but you really live out with the people and understand the culture. And that is leading into my next question. I'll start with Judy on this. What are some of the interests that you do pursue on these kind of trips, in particular on this trip to Greece?
That would probably take all three of us to answer them. Well, we had 33 people in all, and each person brought an entirely different background, so we pursued whatever interests people already happened to have, and then many others developed them as they went along. So some of them were the fairly standard things, you know, Greek history and culture from the Bronze Age, the Classical era, Byzantine culture, which people didn't know as much about. We got real interested, I think Jim may have mentioned this last week, in modern Greece and especially World War II on the island of Crete, where the resistance to the German occupation was such a ferocious part of the war. That became very interesting to us. So those are the more or less predictable things, but we had all kinds of rather offbeat interests too.
I think maybe that just brings to mind one occasion that I just cherish very much. We were at Mycenae. We went down to is it the tomb of Artemis?
Atreus, the treasury of Atreus, yeah.
And these are beehive tombs, and the group gathered in there, and we sat around the edges. There was some stone that we could sit on inside there, and we hit a note. Remember, we were singing in there, and the harmonics were just beautiful. I mean, there was that kind of bonding that we experienced because we were all experiencing the same thing together. It's just a marvelous
thing. People got, besides, for instance, we went down there to study the architecture and the history of these incredible stone monuments, but we got so involved in trying to imaginatively relive history. I don't even know whose idea it was to sort of reenact an ancient funeral, but somebody started chanting over there, and it was really eerie. On another occasion, this was one of Jim's great high moments in the tour. We were at Delphi and trying to reenact for ourselves some of what it would have been like in the classical era to go and consult the oracle. And so Len Matty played the Pythia, the famous oracle, and Jim starred as the sacrificial goat.
And you have this on video because we have seen some of this video.
That's right.
I guess one of the things that impresses me so much about your trip is that you tried to not only study history and learn about the process, but you try to bring it to life through some humor and some acting.
Oh, yeah. We had a wonderful group of people for doing that.
Jim, I talked to you a little bit about this last week, but I want to pursue it a little bit further, that being in the field of English and literature, you particularly, I think, must have been very much touched by the things that you have learned about Greece on your different trips there, and through some of the acting that you people did, but also the places you visited. Would you just elaborate a little bit more upon that for us?
Well, probably the most interesting thing for me was to go back to Epidavros. Again, it's a wonderful place. It's a very quiet place with a lot of greenery, and you don't expect a lot of greenery in Greece because it's rather warm there. But there are cool areas that you can walk in, and it was originally, Judy could probably elaborate more on this, but as I understand it was originally used sort of like a sanitarium where people would go to recover from whatever malady they were suffering. And it has a kind of healing effect. And the theater there, of course, is one of the, I think it is the largest theater still in existence, and it's still being used. In fact, Judy and I saw Agamemnon perform there 2 years ago. And it's a wonderful place with wonderful acoustics, and I could just sit there on the steps, those stone steps, and think about all of the plays that I've seen, Medea and Oedipus the King and so forth, and those were all performed there, you know, several thousand years ago, and think about that setting and what it must have been like and the people and so on. So I found that to be just a really remarkable experience.
It's really extraordinary. The theater seats 14,000 people, and when you go for a production of one of the ancient tragedies, and they're produced in modern Greek, you can hear virtually every language in the world being spoken around you by all of the people who are there shoulder to shoulder. I mean, they pack this place out on a summer night, and when it begins, and you don't even need a mic or anything, the acoustics, as our physics expert here can tell you, the acoustics are just extraordinary. But you could hear a pin drop. People are so fascinated, you know, watching this, even though most of them presumably don't speak Greek. So
what an enrichment experience for each of you individually, but I also instantly was aware from Jim's comments, like what rich experience that you bring back into the classroom and helps many generations after you return.
That's great.
Janelle Berg.
Your enthusiasm is catching, and so I hope that some of our viewers are going to want to take a trip to Greece or elsewhere, but you have some tips for traveling, I know. And let's start with Lloyd and talk a little bit about what are some of the suggestions you have for people when they go to visit a country.
Right, and this comes from a long experience because that, in effect, when I was living in Greece, that's what I was doing, is traveling. And I think the first thing you want to think about when you're traveling is to travel light. I mean, you have to pack enough into the smallest parcel that you can imagine to make your trip comfortable. Because if you're hauling around large suitcases, it's not going to be fun. Judy?
Yeah. Well, one of the big ones, particularly in Greece, that I would recommend is to go early and try and avoid the high tourist season. The best months to visit Greece, I think, are April and May and June. Right. July and August, it gets much more hot and much more crowded.
What is the weather like in April, May, and June?
Well, it was not a very typical spring, was it?
No.
Jim and I have been many times to Greece, and this is the first time we'd ever seen rain for the first few days. And then that passed, and it got really quite warm. The heat was a bit of a problem for some of the people on the tour, because that's sure a tip we would, I think, all second. When you're traveling in a warm country like that, you don't realize how dehydrated you can become. And we had a couple people in the early days of the trip actually faint from that, until one of our tour members, who was a doctor, sat us all down and gave us a very stern lecture and instructed us all to drink at least 3 liters a day of water, whether we were feeling thirsty or not. And then people were fine. But you just, when you're from a northern climate, you don't realize how that's going to affect you.
Jim, what kind of a tip would you have for people who are traveling?
Well, I think I just follow up on a point that Judy made there. You know, all of these recent shots we see from Saudi Arabia, where our troops are there, the water bottles that they're drinking are exactly the same ones we were drinking
so familiar, that's right.
And I think their recommendation is 6 liters a day or something,
But
or 6 gallons a day.
6
gallons a day.
And well, we don't have to wear the heavy suits like they did, but that's certainly something you have to be very careful about and watch that, because if you get dehydrated, you will get lightheaded, and in one case we had a woman almost pass out. She thought she was having a heart attack, and it's a serious problem. So you have to remember, you're not living, it's not like Coeur d'Alene in the summertime. It's a whole different situation.
Lloyd, what about getting out into the countryside rather than just being at the well-known tourist spots?
Yes.
What would you recommend?
Absolutely. That's the name of the game, of course, is to get away from the cities and the towns and the commercial restaurants and so forth, because they are tourist-oriented. And if you can get out into the country, in Greece, to a local taverna tucked away in a village, and we had an opportunity to do this when we took our famous trip down the Samaria Gorge, which is in the center of Crete, and it's akin to the Grand Canyon. They call it the Grand Canyon of the Mediterranean. And this gave us an opportunity to perhaps visit the hinterland and get out of the city.
Well, can you tell us more about that trip?
Oh, yes. That's a long story in itself. When I lived there, we had occasion to take that trip the first time, and what it is, it's a walk downhill for 11 miles. And we all think, well, downhill, that's not hard. But if you've ever walked downhill for 11 miles, you will find yourself over stones, addressed with a malady that you will never forget. So it's rather a rigorous thing, and this was one of those points where we were engaging our body and not our minds, and we found that the body was not as strong as it should have been. But it was a wonderful trip, and we enjoyed it.
You should have heard people for at least 3 or 4 days after that. Every time we'd go down any flight of stairs, all 33 people would moan in unison from their muscles being pulled.
I had lunch today with one of the members of your group, and she explained the physical demands, and I think you should give a full year's credit in physical education, along with the other credits that might be available.
Yes.
We cannot let this program pass, and of course we're already halfway through with your delightful stories without talking about some of the things you brought back and showing them. I know you people are very much involved with audio-visual aspects to your work and teaching. You just have some beautiful things. I want to ask our camera crew to get ready to go through some of the things you've been kind enough to bring that you now own, and we have them on the table. And if you can just give us some history of these items and also the kind of things that one can appreciate in the Greek culture. Who wishes to start? Lloyd, would you like to start with?
Well,
I know you collect owls.
I collect owls, so we might as well start with owls. And then I'm going to ask Judy to help me, because she perhaps knows a little more about the significance of the owl in Greece. But when I lived there, and this was in the 78 time frame in Crete, I went down to one of the local tourist shops and bought an owl. And it just seemed like the thing to do. Everybody in Greece seemed to have an owl in their house, and so I bought this owl, and this started a very expensive hobby. My latest acquisition, which we made on this last trip, is this very interesting owl that has been carved from a stalactite. And it has the face of an owl that has been drawn into the features of the stalactite. But this has cost me at least $10,000, and I don't have any more room in my house for owls. But significantly, I think, Judy, can you talk a little bit about
Well,
Jim?
I'm somewhat of an owl collector
That's
too,
true.
and Lloyd and I didn't realize that when we first got to know each other, that we had all these things in common. But the owl, of course, is a symbol for Athena, the goddess Athena, and she represents wisdom. And one of the stories I could tell about this is that several years ago, prior to this trip, Judy and I were again at Mycenae and in one of the beehive tombs there, and I saw a slight movement over against the wall. It was a rather dark area of this tomb, and I said, "Something's moving over there." And she said, "Well, what do you think it is?" I said, "I don't know." And so I walked over to see, and it was a small white owl, almost like this one that Lloyd has here, the smallest one. And I've been convinced ever since that was the goddess Athena. She was looking after us that day.
Very good. Very good.
Very interesting.
Judy, I think it would be appropriate if you talked about our logo.
All right, well, do you want to show them
All
our
right.
version of it
Here's
first?
the same thing, if we can get that on camera.
This is our tour survival uniform, and there's a secret to it. This is the logo, which we'll show you again here in a moment, but this is very cleverly designed so that as you're walking, why don't you stand up and show people, tell them what the line there says.
Okay, well, we found out that to survive, there's some key words that you need in Greece, and we were using those, and so we put them on our T-shirt, and they're upside down so you can read them from the standing position. And we have the word ne and ochi, which means yes and no in Greece, and parakalo, which means please, and efaristo, which means thank you, and a very, very important one is how to find the bathroom. Puine toileta.
Very good.
But this is a museum replica of the original source of our logo. This is from Delphi, and it's a wine vessel.
beautiful.
And in the center, what we have is a figure of Apollo, the god Apollo, the god of prophecy, and poetry pouring a libation of wine. So this was a gift from other tour members, and it's kind of a special thing to have. I'll just show you a couple of the other things as long as I'm leaning out here. I just brought this along as an example of the kind of folk crafts that you can find quite easily
That is
in
incredibly
Greece.
beautiful.
Yeah, this is called Skyros ware. It's from the island of Skyros. It's all hand-painted, and if you go into a shop or into one of the open bazaars where they're selling this sort of thing, of course no two of them are remotely alike, so I've brought home over the years, well, Jim's probably broken his back lugging home all of the Skyros ware. And Jim, I think you should. Do you want to tell people about this?
Sure.
It's not what
This
it
is
looks
not
like.
what it looks like, which is a small bottle of ouzo. Actually, what this is water from the Castilian Springs at Delphi. And this water, of course, is what the Pythia would have bathed in before she went in to do her prophecy in the Temple of Apollo. And it actually has some leaves here that were chewed by Lynn Maddie. I think you can see her teeth marks right here in our reenactment of that. And we are planning to, of course, use this in our celebration that's coming up at the end of this month. We're all going to get together again and show slides and so forth. And we're going to imbibe in a little of this because, according to legend, if you drink water from the Castilian Springs, the muse will visit you, because Apollo was the god of poetry, so you will become poetic as a result of that.
Well, it's really just amazing, not only what you brought back, but the stories that you have and the history. In fact, you've absorbed the culture of Greece, and I think that our viewers are appreciating that also. But I'll return to Janelle Berg.
Well, there are a few more things yet, and I want someone to tell me about the little horse that's on the table.
Well, what we're looking at here is another museum replica of an archaic period horse that would be probably from about the 700s BC, geometric style actually, and it's just one that I particularly like, and so I bought it several years ago. There's nothing terribly significant about it. You actually will see great numbers of figures like that in various museums throughout Greece, because the wealth of the Greeks at that period was often measured in the horses that they had.
And next to the horse is a cup with, and so can you tell us about that, Lloyd?
I can a little bit. It's a mortar and pestle, and it was made in an alabaster factory right outside of Hanya, where I lived for 3 years. And these are the things that you pick up as a tourist, of course. And I have them all, including this little one here, which is sort of modern and very commercial looking, but it is beautiful. And the colors, the cobalt colors that are in it, are very unique, I think, to the Greek art.
Maybe I could add a word to what you're saying about the mortar and pestle. Part of the reason that they're such a popular thing to bring back from Crete is that Crete is an incredible place to buy herbs. You walk into the open markets there, and everywhere you're just overwhelmed with the scent of these. And many of the people on the tour brought back whole suitcases just crammed in every little nook with some of the familiar herbs, and also ones that we didn't even know the English names for, but they smelled wonderful. And so that's what that would be used for.
Now, the second half of my question I'd like to ask about, when the Greeks met you, were they curious about you? Jim, how do you respond to their questions about your style of life, what you're doing there?
Well, I'm going to answer this question maybe in somewhat of a roundabout way, but I recall that when we were on the south shore of Crete, in a little town which name escapes me right now. Plakias, that's it. One day Judy and I were looking for some place to stay, and we'd walked around what looked like the end of the town and noticed that there was a little hotel off in the distance, and so proceeded to walk over to it. And she was very dubious about whether we were going to find any place to stay or anybody there that even spoke English. And we walked in the front door and to buy a soft drink or something, and this young woman immediately, who looked Greek, immediately said, "Hello, how are you?" and addressed us in what I thought was either an American accent or a Canadian accent. It turned out it was Canadian. She was originally from Toronto. And so we were quite astonished to meet this young woman, and she was very curious about us and asked many questions. She was actually born on Crete, but then immigrated to Toronto and then returned to marry a young Greek man there. And she was just wonderful, and we had such marvelous talks about the United States and Greek relations and the political situation and whether or not Americans were now looked upon as being welcome guests there and so forth. And which reminds me of one other thing here, maybe somewhat off the subject, but I note that now that the Olympics are going to be held in Atlanta, I'm not sure how the Americans are going to be welcome back there, because there was a lot of feeling on the part of the Greeks that they wanted to have the Olympics there. And so I don't know whether they'll be bitter about that particular one or not.
What is the political climate in relation to the United States and Greece at this time? Is it very positive?
It's improving. In the years that Papandreou and the socialist government were in power, particularly even 2 years ago when Jim and I were there was a considerable amount of anti-Americanism. You'd see lots of anti-Yankee graffiti all over the place, and 2 or 3 times, for the first time 2 years ago, Jim and I had the feeling that people were really being very rude to us because they knew we were Americans. Although I should also say that on that same trip we had a number of Greeks express concern to us about that when they heard that we were Americans. There were not a lot of Americans traveling in Greece 2 years ago, asking us how they'd been treated and apologizing repeatedly for some of the rudeness of some of their countrymen. But this year now, I don't think we found any of that to be so. There's been a change in government, and I would say relations between the two countries are better. We never felt we were in danger, even in the worst of it, but just a few tensions here and there.
And Lloyd, you lived there for some time on Crete, and Jim mentioned last week that with the experience they had during World War II and the Germans, but that through a very short period of history, they're very forgiving people.
Yes. Yes, and I think that probably supports what Judy is saying, in that now that they've had a change in government and a change in heart, I think these things that have gone in the past are quickly forgotten, and they're very, very hospitable people. They want to meet you, and they want to be with you, and they want to talk to you, and they want to treat you as a human being, and they're just wonderful. And I never had any problems. over there, living and going to their, and being part of their families, the weddings, the baptisms, and you know, they just take you into
You got
their family.
invited to a wedding while you were on this trip, I
That's
think.
right.
You're just
Well,
walking
We
down the street.
We
stumbled
walked
upon
into
it.
a wedding.
But we were
Yes, that's right.
They did not try to move
Not
you
at
away.
all.
Not at
They
all,
wanted
no.
to reach out and
They
bring
gave
you
us
in.
rice to throw at
Yeah.
the
That's
bride.
right.
So
That's right.
That's very inclusive rather
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
exclusive.
Oh, they're incredibly curious people. A Greek would think nothing of asking you within 5 minutes of your first meeting how much you make at home, and
do
you know,
you work?
asking every little thing about your family. Whereas most Americans would think that's very bad manners, but they think it's very natural to be
Absolutely.
interested in other people.
We're running very short on time, and I have been so excited, and I know Janelle has too, that I have this sense that we have an audience out there saying, now I want to go to Greece, or I want to go somewhere in Europe, or wherever. And I'd like to start with Judy in particular, since she's planned a lot of those, and of course Jim has been very involved with very successful trips to Scotland, and so maybe they would share this. What are some of the future plans for your program at North Alabama College, and how would you like to let our viewers know how that's going to come about?
Yeah, well, the plans are still evolving very much, but we have a fairly firm plan for next summer now, and that is to do a study tour of England and Scotland. It would be 16 days in July, with 5 days in England, not going into London at all for the first time, although London is a possible add-on at the end. But instead, what we want to do is get out of the big cities. I head first of all for the West Country to Salisbury, Stonehenge, a lot of the wonderful ancient monuments, visit some of the sites associated with the Arthurian legends, then head up to York, which is a superb medieval town, and then spend the remainder of the time in Scotland, mostly in the Highlands and Islands, with a bit of time in Edinburgh and Glasgow as well, focusing on just the life of the common people, and especially the Gaelic-speaking Highlanders and Islanders. So that's next summer, and you want to tell them what we're planning for the following year?
We're even looking 2 years ahead, and we're so enamored with Greece and that part of the world that we're thinking of doing the Cyclades Islands, the Greek islands, and Turkey.
I'm so sorry to have to interrupt, but viewers can contact this program and we'll get all the information to you.
bet.
On behalf of Janelle Burke and our panel, we thank you so much as dear colleagues for what you have brought with us today and last week also, and we're very excited and wish you well on future trips, and hopefully we can be with you on one of those trips in the future.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed our program, and we'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we'll discuss an important subject. And I'd like to end the program today with a Greek term, if that's possible, since my exposure to the Greek language is almost zero, but kalou tuxedo.
That's close
Happy
enough.
journeys, that's
Happy
right.
journeys.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.